The trail maps end at Copper Creek, but the path doesn't. Beyond the marked boundary of Daniel Boone National Forest, where cell towers lose their grip and GPS units spin like broken compasses, the old deer trace climbs toward something that shouldn't exist. Up through laurel thickets and stands of ancient hemlock, past stones arranged in patterns that predate surveyors' chains, the mountain holds its secret close. Those who've glimpsed Harrow's End describe a collection of weathered houses nestled in a hidden valley, smoke rising from chimneys that shouldn't draw, gardens growing in soil that should be too thin. The children watch from porches but never wave. The adults speak in whispers that carry farther than shouts. And when darkness falls over the Blue Ridge, they say you can hear the church bell tolling the hours. Though the steeple collapsed in 1923 and the bronze bell lies cracked in cemetery grass. The town that doesn't exist has kept its covenant for nearly 2 centuries. Some promises, once made, can never be broken. The surveyor's theodolite had been reading wrong for 3 days when Marcus Webb finally accepted that something fundamental had shifted in the mountains. October wind carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves through valleys that his USGS maps insisted were uninhabited wilderness. The sound of his boots on limestone gravel echoed against ridges that rose steeper than the topographic lines suggested. And twice he'd found stone foundations where his instruments said only forest should grow. Webb had spent 15 years mapping remote corners of Appalachia for the National Forest Service. He understood how mountains could play tricks with elevation readings, how morning fog could make ridges appear and disappear like mirages. But standing at the edge of what his GPS called empty space, looking down at shingled rooftops and garden plots carved into terraced hillsides, he felt the careful certainty of his profession begin to crack. The settlement lay cupped in a natural bowl between 3 peaks, accessible only through a narrow gap that his survey team had missed on 5 previous passes through this section of the Blue Ridge. 47 structures, he counted through his field glasses, frame houses with deep porches and tin roofs that had weathered to the color of old copper. A church with a broken spire pointing toward low-hanging clouds. Gardens still showing late tomatoes and winter squash, though the growing season should have ended weeks ago at this elevation. What troubled Webb most deeply was the silence. No generator hum, no chainsaw echo, none of the mechanical background noise that marked even the most isolated mountain communities. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and something else. A rhythmic creaking that might have been porch swings moving in unison, though he saw no one sitting on those weathered boards. His radio crackled with static when he tried to raise base camp. The satellite phone displayed no signal bars. Even his analog compass needle drifted lazily, unable to find true north in this pocket of the mountains where normal rules seemed suspended. Survey log, October 14th, 2019. He whispered into his voice recorder. Discovered unmapped settlement approximately 12 miles northeast of Copper Creek Trailhead. Population unknown. Structures appear to predate Forest Service acquisition of surrounding land. A church bell began to toll somewhere below him, bronze notes rolling up the mountainside like smoke. Webb counted 12 chimes, though his watch showed 3:47 p.m. The sound seemed to come from the broken steeple, though he could see no bell hanging in its shadow. The recording device in his hand had gone silent. The Harrow family had come to these mountains in 1838, following Cherokee traces that led deeper into the Blue Ridge than any European had previously traveled. Jeremiah Harrow brought his wife Sarah, 3 sons and 2 daughters up from the valley settlements, carrying seed corn and breeding livestock and something else. a covenant written in his grandfather's careful script, sealed with wax that bore the impression of symbols older than any church. Those first winters nearly broke them. The soil ran thin over limestone bedrock, and the growing season measured barely 4 months between killing frosts. 2 of the children died that first year, buried in ground so frozen that Jeremiah had to build fires to soften it enough for graves. By spring of 1839, the surviving family members understood that normal farming would never sustain them in this isolated valley. The solution came to Sarah in dreams that felt more like memories inherited from blood she'd never known flowed in her veins. Her grandmother had spoken of old ways brought across the ocean, practices that established communities never discussed in daylight hours, methods of ensuring that crops grew despite poor soil, that children thrived despite harsh winters, that families endured despite the isolation that drove other mountain settlers back to the valleys after a season or two. The first ritual took place on Halloween night, 1839. 7 adults gathered in what would become the church, though no denomination would ever claim it. They spoke words that Sarah remembered without ever having learned them, made promises that bound not just themselves, but every generation that would follow. The mountain would provide for them, and they would provide for the mountain in return. By spring of 1840, their gardens produced vegetables that grew larger and sweeter than anything the valley farms could manage. Their livestock fattened on mountain grass that should have been too sparse to support them. Their children, born in the years that followed, arrived stronger and healthier than any doctor's predictions suggested possible. But the covenant demanded its price. Every generation, when the population grew too large for the valley's hidden resources, families would simply vanish. Neighbors would wake to find houses empty, gardens untended, no sign of struggle or departure. The mountain had called in its debt, and payment was always rendered in full. By 1860, when the outside world began to take careful note of population centers for tax and military purposes, Harrow's end had learned to make itself invisible. Census takers who climbed too high into the mountains found their maps leading them in circles, their horses refusing to follow certain paths. The few who glimpsed the settlement from distant ridges returned to report only empty valleys and stands of virgin timber. The church bell, cast in Philadelphia and hauled up the mountain on muleback, rang every day at noon and 6 and midnight for 83 years. Then came the storm of 1923 that toppled the steeple and cracked the bronze. But the covenant had grown stronger over 8 decades, and some sounds echo longer than their sources. The bell still rings. Webb descended toward the settlement as afternoon shadows stretched across the valley floor, his surveyor's instincts overriding the growing certainty that he was making a terrible mistake. The path down the mountainside felt older than the rocks themselves, worn smooth by generations of feet, though he'd found no record of any settlement in this area dating back to the original Cherokee territorial maps. The first house he approached sat behind a garden where pumpkins grew to impossible size and late roses bloomed despite the October cold. An elderly woman worked among the plants with movements that suggested bone-deep familiarity with soil that should have been too poor to support such abundance. She looked up as his boots crunched on the gravel pathway, and Webb felt the weight of evaluation in her pale gray eyes. "You're not supposed to be here," she said without preamble. Her voice carried the distinctive mountain accent that linguists claimed had preserved Elizabethan pronunciations lost everywhere else in the English-speaking world. "Maps don't show this place for good reason." Webb pulled out his GPS unit, its screen flickering between coordinates that made no geographical sense. I'm with the Forest Service. We're updating boundary surveys for the National Forest. I need to know how long this settlement has existed and who holds legal title to the land. The woman's laugh sounded like wind through autumn leaves. Legal title. As if the mountain cares about paper from government offices. She straightened, her hands still dark with soil that looked richer than anything that should grow at this elevation. Been here since before your government existed, stranger. Been here since before your maps meant anything to anyone who matters. Ma'am, I'm required to report any structures within the forest boundary to... Report to who? She gestured toward his silent radio, his dead phone, his spinning compass. Your machines don't work here because this place exists outside what they're built to measure. You want to survey something that's already been measured by older instruments than your kind ever dreamed. Webb looked past her toward the other houses, noting how the architecture seemed to blend styles from different eras. Colonial stone foundations supporting Victorian gingerbread trim and Depression-era tin roofing, as if each generation had added what it needed without concern for historical consistency. How many people live here? Enough, the woman said. Always enough. Never too many. Children's voices drifted from behind the houses, but Webb couldn't see the speakers. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like echoes bouncing off valley walls. He strained to make out words, but heard only syllables that might have been English, or might have been something older. The church bell began to toll again, though Webb's watch now showed 4:15 p.m. He counted the chimes. 13, 14, 15, 16. Time moved differently here, measured by rhythms that his instruments couldn't calibrate. You should leave before dark, the woman said, turning back to her impossible garden. Mountain gets hungry after sunset. Feeds on strangers who don't know the old agreements. Webb wanted to ask what she meant, but the words stuck in his throat as the temperature dropped 15 degrees in as many seconds. His breath began to fog, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of doors closing all through the settlement. One by one, the lights behind lace curtains went dark. The only official attempt to count Harrow's end had taken place in 1870, when federal enumerators spread across the mountains to document every soul for reconstruction planning. Samuel Morrison climbed these ridges in August heat, carrying census forms and a stubborn certainty that no American community could remain unmapped in an age of steam and telegraph. His field notes, discovered in Tennessee State Archives in 1998, tell a story that contradicts every demographic record from that decade. August 7, 1870, found settlement of approximately 200 souls in previously unmapped valley. Residents claim continuous habitation since 1830s, but produce no deeds, no tax records, no correspondence with outside authorities. Children appear well-fed despite apparent isolation. Adults courteous but evasive regarding governance, economic activities, or religious affiliation. Morrison spent 3 days attempting to complete his enumeration, but his forms kept coming up short. Families he'd counted in mourning would deny being residents by afternoon. Houses that had been occupied at breakfast stood empty by dinner. Most disturbing of all, the population seemed to shift not through any movement he could observe, but through some mechanism that operated beyond the reach of normal perception. His final entry, dated August 10th, reads simply, "Recommend this district be classified as uninhabited wilderness. No permanent residents requiring federal services." The census of 1870 lists no population center within 50 miles of where Marcus Webb now stood, watching smoke rise from chimneys that shouldn't exist. Morrison himself returned to the valley settlements, claiming to have found nothing but empty ridges and stands of timber. He lived 37 more years, working as a store clerk in Knoxville, and never spoke publicly about those 3 days in the mountains. But his daughter later recalled that he would sometimes wake screaming about children who counted themselves differently each time you tried to number them, and bells that rang the hours of a day that contained more time than God had ever intended. Webb pulled Morrison's notes up on his phone during the brief moment when cellular service flickered back to life. The coordinates Morrison had recorded placed his uninhabited wilderness exactly where Webb now stood, surrounded by evidence of continuous occupation spanning nearly 2 centuries. Either Morrison had lied in his official report, or the settlement had learned to hide itself so completely that even trained observers found only what they expected to find. The implications made Webb's surveyor's mind reel. How many other communities had mastered the art of selective invisibility? How much of rural America existed in spaces between official acknowledgement, sustaining itself through agreements that predated any government's authority? He looked again at the houses around him, noting details that his professional training should have cataloged immediately. No power lines, but electric light glowing behind windows. No phone service, but conversations being conducted in voices too distant and too coordinated to be coincidental. The settlement operated according to rules that his instruments couldn't measure. Reverend James Whitlock had been serving circuit churches through the Blue Ridge for 43 years when he first heard reports of a congregation that met where no church should exist. Mountain people were reluctant to discuss Harrow's end directly, but they spoke around it the way they spoke around cancer or bad weather. Something unfortunate that everyone knew about, but no one wanted to name. The stories came in fragments during Sunday services at legitimate churches. A family in Copper Creek mentioned relatives who'd moved up the mountain and were never heard from again. An elderly woman in Pine Ridge asked prayers for souls living beyond the reach of proper preaching. A young man in Millerville confessed to dreams about hymns sung in harmonies that hurt to remember. Whitlock had built his ministry on reaching the isolated families that other denominations considered too remote for regular service. He carried his Bible into hollows where roads ended and paths began, establishing prayer groups in communities that measured distance in hours of walking rather than miles of driving. But every reference to Harrow's end included warnings that made even the most faithful mountain Christians cross themselves and change subjects. Some places ain't meant for Christian feet, an old-timer in Copper Creek told him after Sunday service. Some places got their own arrangements with powers that don't much care for competition. By the fall of 1896, Whitlock's curiosity had overwhelmed his caution. He packed his saddlebags with Bibles and hymnals and set out to bring the gospel to whatever congregation awaited him in that unmapped valley. He followed creek beds and game trails, guided by directions that relied more on intuition than landmarks, until he found the settlement nestled between ridges that his maps insisted contained only wilderness. The church building dominated the center of the community, its broken spire reaching toward clouds that seemed to hang lower here than anywhere else in the mountains. The structure combined architectural elements that shouldn't have coexisted. Gothic arches supporting a colonial roof, stained glass windows depicting scenes that borrowed from Christian iconography but included symbols Whitlock didn't recognize. The congregation that gathered for his unannounced service filled every pew despite his arrival being completely unexpected. Men, women, and children filed in wearing clothes that spanned decades of fashion, as if the settlement existed outside normal temporal flow. They listened politely to his sermon, joined in familiar hymns, and recited prayers that followed traditional patterns while somehow conveying entirely different meanings. After the service, the eldest member of the congregation approached him with questions that tested theological ground Whitlock had never explored. What did Scripture say about covenants that predated Abraham? How should Christians interpret promises made to powers that had answered before Christ was born? Could faith in Jesus coexist with obligations to entities that had protected communities since before the gospel reached these mountains? Whitlock spent 3 days in theological discussions that challenged every certainty he'd built his ministry upon. The people of Harrow's End were deeply religious, but their faith incorporated elements that no seminary had prepared him to address. They honored Christ, but they also honored agreements with forces that Christianity classified as either non-existent or demonic. "We've been blessed since 1839, the eldest explained on Whitlock's final morning. Our children grow strong, our harvests sustain us, our families endure when others flee the mountain. We honor the source of those blessings, whether or not it fits your church's understanding." Whitlock left Harrow's End with theological questions that would torment him for the rest of his ministry. He never returned to the settlement, but he never reported it to denominational authorities either. Some spiritual territories, he realized, existed beyond the reach of institutional religion. In his private journals, he wrote, "Found souls neither saved nor damned, but bound by covenants that predate salvation itself." He died in 1921, having never resolved his questions about whether faith could coexist with obligations to powers that Christian doctrine refused to acknowledge. The soil samples that Webb collected should have tested as typical Appalachian mountain dirt: thin, acidic, depleted by decades of mining and logging. Instead, the laboratory results that arrived 3 weeks later described mineral compositions that made no geological sense and organic compounds that the testing facility couldn't identify. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the soil scientist who processed Webb's samples, called him personally to discuss findings that challenged basic assumptions about mountain agriculture. The dirt from Harrow's End contained nutrient levels comparable to the richest river bottomland, despite being collected from ridges that should have supported only scrub forest. More mysteriously, the organic matter included molecular structures that resembled known compounds, but exhibited properties that violated fundamental chemistry. This soil should be capable of supporting agricultural productivity far beyond what the climate and elevation would normally allow, Vasquez explained during their phone conversation. But some of these organic signatures don't match anything in our databases. It's as if the soil has been enhanced through processes we don't currently understand. Webb shared Vasquez's findings with the Forest Service archaeologist assigned to evaluate any historical sites discovered during his survey. Dr. Patricia Nguyen had spent her career excavating Native American settlements throughout Appalachia, but the artifacts Webb described from Harrow's End didn't fit any known cultural patterns. The Cherokee had a sophisticated agricultural system, but they never established permanent settlements at these elevations, Nguyen explained during their meeting at the regional office. The growing season is too short, the soil too poor. Any community that survived up there for nearly 2 centuries would need agricultural techniques that go beyond anything documented in the archaeological record. More troubling were the reports of modern amenities operating without visible infrastructure. Webb's photographs showed electric lights in windows despite the absence of power lines, running water despite no visible wells or plumbing, and communication systems that functioned despite complete isolation from telephone or internet networks. Traditional mountain communities developed remarkable self-sufficiency, Nguyen acknowledged. But this level of technological independence suggests either hidden infrastructure or... She paused, unwilling to voice possibilities that fell outside academic respectability. Webb's investigation into land ownership records revealed a bureaucratic maze that seemed deliberately constructed to obscure legal clarity. The settlement occupied territory that had been transferred between federal, state, and private ownership multiple times since 1840. But no current deed holder could be identified. Property tax records showed no assessments for structures in that area, yet satellite imagery clearly revealed buildings that should have triggered automatic reassessment. The legal ambiguity extended to regulatory oversight. No utility company claimed service responsibility for the area. No postal route included deliveries to those coordinates. No emergency services maintained response protocols for that district. Harrow's End existed in an administrative void that insulated it from government interference while providing no protection against government action. It's as if they've mastered the art of bureaucratic invisibility, Webb reported to his supervisor. They avoid regulation by staying below official notice, but they also forfeit any legal protection if someone decides to force the issue. The implications made Forest Service administrators nervous. If Harrow's End had no legal standing, it could be classified as an illegal settlement and forcibly removed. But if the community possessed some form of legitimate claim dating to pre-federal occupation, any action against them could trigger lawsuits that would tie up land management for decades. More disturbing was the possibility that other similar communities existed throughout national forests, operating under agreements that predated current legal frameworks. How many invisible settlements had learned to sustain themselves through methods that modern science couldn't explain or reproduce? The questions multiplied faster than answers. Dr. Amanda Foster had been serving mountain communities as a circuit physician for 12 years when she first encountered children from Harrow's End. They appeared in her clinic in Pine Ridge during the spring of 2006, brought by adults who provided no explanation for the hour-long hike required to reach the nearest road. The medical anomalies began with routine examinations that produced impossible results. Children who appeared to be 8 or 9 years old possessed bone development consistent with adolescence. Blood work revealed genetic markers that suggested extraordinary resistance to diseases common in isolated populations. Most puzzling of all, several children displayed healing from injuries that should have required months of recovery time. Foster's medical notes, subpoenaed during a custody dispute 3 years later, documented health indicators that challenged basic assumptions about mountain medicine. Patient presence as female, approximately age 10, accompanied by unidentified adult. Physical development suggests excellent nutrition despite claimed residence in area without documented food sources. No evidence of dental decay, despite apparent lack of regular dental care. Healing tissue on left forearm consistent with significant laceration occurred approximately 2 weeks prior. Rate of recovery exceeds normal expectations. The custody case involved a Pine Ridge family claiming that their daughter had been taken to Harrow's End against their wishes. The child had disappeared for 6 weeks, before returning with stories about relatives who lived up the mountain and taught children things that regular schools couldn't understand. When social services investigated, they found no evidence of kidnapping, but the girl's subsequent medical examinations revealed health improvements that couldn't be explained through conventional treatment. Foster testified that the child showed evidence of dietary supplementation that had corrected several nutritional deficiencies documented in previous examinations. Her vision had improved, despite no reported eye care. A chronic respiratory condition that had required regular medication showed complete resolution with no apparent intervention. In 30 years of rural medicine, I've never seen health improvements this dramatic without significant medical intervention, Foster stated in her deposition. Whatever treatment this child received during her absence achieved results that our best pediatric specialists would consider remarkable. The custody case ended abruptly when the family withdrew their complaint and moved to another county. Foster's attempts to follow up with the child were unsuccessful, and subsequent inquiries about Harrow's end were met with official silence from social services administrators. But Foster continued to encounter children from the settlement over the following years. They appeared irregularly, always accompanied by adults who paid in cash and provided minimal personal information. The medical patterns remained consistent: exceptional health, accelerated healing, genetic markers that suggested protection against common mountain ailments. Most disturbing were the children who showed evidence of injuries that should have been fatal. Foster documented bone fractures that had healed without professional setting, head trauma that showed no lasting neurological effects, and exposure injuries that should have resulted in permanent damage, but left no detectable complications. These children are either receiving medical care that surpasses anything available in regional hospitals, or their genetic makeup provides resistance to trauma that I've never encountered in medical literature, Foster wrote in her private notes. Neither explanation fits with their reported living conditions. What would you do if your professional training told you children were receiving impossible care? But every attempt to investigate led to bureaucratic dead ends and threats to your medical license. Foster chose to document everything while saying nothing. She maintained detailed records of her examinations, preserved tissue samples for future analysis, and photographed evidence of miraculous healing. But she never reported her findings to medical authorities or child protective services. Some secrets, she learned, were too dangerous to share with institutions that couldn't protect the people who revealed them. Antique dealer Harrison Mills had built his reputation by acquiring mountain artifacts that documented vanished ways of life throughout Appalachia. His shop in Asheville attracted collectors who sought authentic examples of traditional crafts: hand-woven coverlets, carved wooden tools, pottery made from native clay. But the items that began appearing in estate sales during the early 2000s challenged his expertise in ways that left him questioning the boundaries between craft and something else entirely. The first piece arrived through a dealer in Knoxville who claimed it came from a family settling an estate in the mountains. The object appeared to be a butter churn, crafted from wood that felt heavier than oak but lighter than walnut, stained with natural dyes that created patterns too complex for traditional folk art. When Mills examined it under magnification, he found carving details that suggested techniques unknown to documented Appalachian woodworkers. More intriguing was the churn's function. When operated according to the traditional method, it produced butter in half the normal time, with a richness that suggested cream from cattle fed on impossible pastures. Mills tested the device repeatedly, using store-bought dairy products, and consistently achieved results that defied dairy science. The second artifact, a quilting frame, arrived 6 months later through a different dealer who provided equally vague provenance. The frame's construction incorporated joinery methods that Mills couldn't identify, wood treatments that resisted aging, and metal hardware that showed no signs of oxidation despite apparent exposure to mountain weather. Quilts produced on the frame displayed patterns that seemed to shift depending on viewing angle, colors that remained vivid despite washing that should have caused fading. By 2008, Mills had acquired 17 items that shared similar characteristics: exceptional craftsmanship, mysterious provenance, and functional properties that exceeded normal expectations. The collection included kitchen tools that improved any food prepared with them, farming implements that increased crop yields, household items that seemed to maintain themselves without care. Mills's attempt to research the artifact's origins led him through mountain communities where elderly residents would examine his photographs with expressions that mixed recognition and fear. Most claimed no knowledge of the item's makers, but a few offered warnings that suggested deeper familiarity. "Some things ain't meant to leave the mountain," an elderly woman in Marshall told him after examining photographs of a carved spoon that enhanced the flavor of any soup it stirred. "Some families got ways of making things that work too well for regular folks to understand." The breakthrough came when Mills encountered a dealer in Bristol who recognized one of his photographs immediately. The man had grown up in Copper Creek and remembered stories about families who lived above the tree line and made things that lasted longer and worked better than anything available in valley stores. "My grandmother used to talk about the Harrow folk," the dealer explained. "Said they'd trade crafts for supplies sometimes, but you had to be careful what you accepted. Their things came with obligations that most families weren't prepared to honor." Mills learned that the artifacts represented a shadow economy that had operated throughout the mountains for generations. Families in settlements like Harrow's End would trade exceptional crafts for materials they couldn't produce locally. Metal tools, glass containers, manufactured cloth. But the trades came with unspoken agreements that bound purchasers to secrecy and sometimes to more complex obligations. Several of Mills's sources mentioned families who had accepted too many items from the mountain communities and found themselves unable to function without them. Kitchens that couldn't produce edible meals without the enhanced tools. Gardens that failed when planted with normal implements. Households that slowly became dependent on artifacts that couldn't be repaired or replaced through conventional means. "It's like they put a piece of their place into everything they make," one collector explained. "And once you get used to having that piece, you can't go back to regular things that work like regular things should." Mills realized he'd been documenting not just superior craftsmanship, but evidence of communities that had developed technologies indistinguishable from magic. The mountain settlements weren't just preserving traditional ways of life. They were evolving those traditions into something that transcended normal human capabilities. Webb's preliminary report triggered a cascade of federal attention that transformed his routine survey into a classified investigation spanning multiple agencies. Within 72 hours of his submission, representatives from the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of Agriculture, the Census Bureau, and two agencies that declined to identify themselves had established a temporary command post at the Pine Ridge Ranger Station. The sudden bureaucratic intensity made Webb understand that Harrow's End represented more than an administrative curiosity. His discovery had apparently activated protocols that suggested government awareness of similar situations elsewhere. The agencies coordinated their response with efficiency that indicated prior experience handling communities that existed outside normal oversight. Special Agent Janet Rodriguez from the Bureau of Land Management took charge of the interagency task force. Her credentials included advanced degrees in land management and law, but her questions revealed familiarity with situations that no university curriculum would have covered. She knew exactly what evidence to request, which records to subpoena, and which legal frameworks might apply to communities that had operated beyond federal jurisdiction for multiple generations. "We need to establish current population, property ownership status, compliance with federal regulations, and any potential national security implications," Rodriguez explained during the initial briefing. "Some remote communities have developed capabilities that could pose risks if left unmonitored." The Census Bureau provided context that chilled Webb's blood. Government databases contained records of 17 similar settlements scattered across federal lands throughout Appalachia the Ozarks, the Northern Rockies, and the Pacific Northwest. Most had been identified through satellite imagery or accidental discovery, but none had been successfully enumerated or regulated. Attempts at direct contact had produced results ranging from bureaucratic frustration to personnel losses that were classified at levels above Webb's clearance. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Department of Agriculture brought soil analysis equipment that made Webb's field testing kit look primitive. Her preliminary readings confirmed what Webb's samples had suggested: agricultural productivity that violated fundamental assumptions about mountain farming. But Chen's instruments detected additional anomalies that suggested deliberate soil modification using techniques unknown to modern agriculture. These mineral signatures are consistent with enhancement methods that would require industrial-level chemical processing, Chen reported. But we found no evidence of the infrastructure that would support such operations. Either they've hidden extremely sophisticated facilities, or they've developed agricultural techniques that our science can't currently explain or duplicate. The unnamed agencies contributed surveillance equipment that monitored Harrow's end from distances that prevented direct observation while documenting activity patterns, thermal signatures, and electromagnetic emissions. The data revealed a community that operated according to schedules unrelated to external time references, energy consumption that suggested power sources not connected to regional grids, and communication patterns that bypassed conventional networks while maintaining remarkable coordination. Most troubling was evidence of technological capabilities that exceeded regional infrastructure. Thermal imaging detected heating systems that operated without fuel sources. Communications monitoring identified data transmissions that used frequencies not allocated for civilian use. Ground-penetrating radar suggested underground construction that would have required industrial equipment to excavate. We're dealing with a community that's achieved technological independence through methods we can't identify, Rodriguez summarized during the week's final briefing. They pose no immediate threat, but their capabilities raise questions about how many other settlements have developed similar resources. Webb realized that his discovery had revealed not just one hidden community, but evidence of a parallel civilization that had evolved alongside mainstream American society while avoiding detection through methods that bordered on supernatural. The government's response suggested that Harrow's end was part of a larger phenomenon that threatened assumptions about federal authority over American territory. The federal task force established its forward operating base at Copper Creek, using the seasonal hunting lodge as headquarters for what Rodriguez classified as peaceful contact and assessment protocols. The location provided staging for multiple approach routes, while maintaining enough distance to avoid triggering defensive responses from the settlement. 3 teams would make simultaneous contact. Rodriguez would lead the primary diplomatic mission up the main trail, carrying credentials and official documents that established federal authority over the territory. Dr. Chen would approach from the eastern ridge with agricultural specialists, authorized to assess land use and environmental impact. The third team, composed of agents whose agencies remained unnamed, would monitor from concealed positions while documenting any unusual defensive measures or evacuation procedures. Webb found himself assigned to Rodriguez's team despite his preference for maintaining the observer status that had protected him during his initial contact. His familiarity with the settlement's layout and his existing relationship with residents made him valuable for negotiations, but his surveyor's instincts warned him that the federal approach would trigger responses that could endanger everyone involved. These people have avoided government contact for nearly 2 centuries, Webb argued during the final planning session. They've developed systems we don't understand, capabilities we can't measure, and defensive strategies we haven't anticipated. Walking in there with federal badges and legal documents is likely to produce confrontation rather than cooperation. Rodriguez's response revealed the task force's true priorities. Mr. Webb, this community has operated outside federal jurisdiction while developing technologies that could pose national security risks if transferred to hostile entities. Our mandate is to assess their capabilities and establish regulatory oversight, not to negotiate their continued independence. The approach began at dawn on October 23rd, with teams moving along predetermined routes, while monitoring each other through communication systems that failed to function as soon as the settlement came into direct line of sight. Webb watched his radio dissolve into static, his GPS unit spin through impossible coordinates, and his cell phone display nothing but error messages as they descended into the valley that shouldn't exist. But Harrow's end had prepared for this moment. The settlement that Webb had found bustling with quiet activity now appeared completely abandoned. No smoke rose from chimneys, no lights glowed behind windows, no sounds of daily life echoed from the structures that lined the valley floor. Rodriguez's team reached the settlement's edge to find houses that looked like museum displays, furniture arranged in rooms that suggested recent occupation, gardens showing evidence of careful tending, animals that watched from pastures but approached no closer than 50 yards. Everything indicated a community that had vanished completely in the time between surveillance confirmation and direct approach. The church dominated the center of the empty settlement, its broken spire pointing toward clouds that seemed to gather despite clear weather in the surrounding mountains. The building's doors stood open, revealing an interior that defied the architectural limitations suggested by its exterior dimensions. Rows of pews extended farther than the building's outer walls should have allowed, and stained glass windows depicted scenes that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Chen's team reported similar findings from their eastern approach: agricultural plots that showed evidence of recent harvesting, but no sign of the people who had worked them. Livestock that grazed peacefully but retreated when humans approached. Infrastructure that suggested a thriving community but produced no evidence of current habitation. The third team's communications had gone completely silent. Rodriguez established a temporary command post in the settlement's central square, using portable equipment that functioned intermittently and produced readings that made no technological sense. Her attempts to document the abandoned buildings revealed construction techniques that combined traditional craftsmanship with engineering principles that challenged structural physics. But Webb understood that Harrow's end hadn't been abandoned. The settlement had simply withdrawn into dimensions that federal authority couldn't reach, leaving behind empty shells that would satisfy bureaucratic requirements while protecting the community's essential nature. The real confrontation was just beginning. The answer lay in the church basement, behind a door that Webb's initial survey had failed to detect. Rodriguez's team discovered the entrance only when their ground-penetrating radar indicated hollow spaces beneath the building that exceeded the structure's apparent foundation. The stairs descended into bedrock that had been carved into chambers using techniques that predated European settlement by centuries. The walls displayed murals that combined Native American petroglyphs with symbols borrowed from European folk magic and notations written in scripts that none of the team members could identify. But Dr. Chen's linguistic training included enough Cherokee to recognize fragments of agreements that established territorial boundaries and mutual obligations between human communities and entities that Cherokee oral tradition classified as the first dwellers. The chamber's center contained a stone table carved from a single piece of mountain granite. The surface bore inscriptions in multiple languages: Cherokee syllabics, Colonial English, German script, and symbols that predated written language entirely. But all versions conveyed the same essential agreement, written in Sarah Harrow's careful script and witnessed by signatures that included names from families throughout the region. Covenant established this 31st day of October, 1839, between the families of Harrow's End and the Ancient Ones, who dwelt in these mountains before human footprints marked the paths. We pledge our descendants to honor the old agreements that preserve life in places where normal sustenance fails. We accept the blessing of abundance in exchange for service when service is required. We bind our children and our children's children to this covenant, that they may prosper where others would perish, but never leave the mountain's protection without permission of those who granted it. The signatures filled 2 pages, representing families whose names appeared in genealogical records throughout Appalachian settlements. But the final signature, marking the acceptance of terms by the covenant's other party, was burned into the stone itself in symbols that hurt to examine directly. Rodriguez photographed the entire document using specialized equipment that captured details invisible to normal cameras. The additional inscriptions revealed amendments added over subsequent decades, modifications that adjusted terms as the community evolved and outside pressures changed. By 1870, the covenant included provisions for concealment from government census takers. By 1920, it addressed protection from developers and mining companies. The most recent edition, dated just 3 years earlier, established protocols for managing contact with federal agencies. They've been updating this agreement for nearly 2 centuries, Rodriguez realized as she studied the photographic evidence. Each generation has added terms that address contemporary threats while maintaining the essential exchange that keeps them prosperous and hidden. Webb examined the covenant's specific provisions and understood why Harrow's End had achieved impossible sustainability. The community had entered into agreements with entities that possessed capabilities modern science couldn't measure or duplicate. In exchange for agricultural abundance, technological independence, and protection from outside interference, the families of Harrow's End had pledged service that the covenant described only as providing what is needed when the need arises. Dr. Chen's analysis of the chamber revealed evidence that the agreements weren't merely ceremonial. The carved walls contained channels filled with substances that registered on her instruments as organic compounds that shouldn't exist according to known chemistry. The stone table showed signs of regular use, with residues that suggested continuing ritual observance of the covenant's requirements. But the most disturbing discovery was the calendar carved into the chamber's far wall. It tracked lunar cycles according to a system that included months unknown to any human calendar, marking dates when specific obligations came due. The next marked date was November 1st, 2019, 8 days away. Rodriguez's team faced the realization that they had stumbled into a community whose survival depended on maintaining agreements with forces that federal authority couldn't regulate, negotiate with, or understand. The covenant had protected Harrow's End for nearly 2 centuries, but federal interference during a critical renewal period might trigger responses that no government protocol was designed to handle. The third team's silence became comprehensible when Rodriguez's group discovered their equipment abandoned at the settlement's northern edge. Cameras, recording devices, and monitoring instruments lay scattered across a meadow where the grass grew in spiral patterns that made no botanical sense. The devices showed evidence of exposure to electromagnetic interference that had scrambled their electronics and erased all recorded data. But the agents themselves had vanished without trace. No footprints led away from their abandoned gear. No signs of struggle marked the disturbed soil. No communication signals registered on emergency frequencies that should have functioned regardless of local interference. 3 trained federal operatives had simply ceased to exist during the 4 hours between their last radio check and the discovery of their equipment. Webb studied the meadow where the agents had disappeared and recognized patterns that his surveyor's training couldn't explain, but his mountain instincts understood. The spiral grass growth, the way morning dew collected in geometric shapes, the manner in which shadows fell despite the sun's position, all suggested that this area existed under rules that normal physics couldn't accommodate. "They weren't taken," he told Rodriguez as her team prepared emergency evacuation procedures. "They were claimed. There's a difference." Rodriguez's attempts to coordinate search and rescue operations met with resistance that extended beyond equipment failure. Radio communications with base camp dissolved into static that formed patterns resembling speech in languages no team member recognized. GPS coordinates shifted continuously, making navigation impossible. Even analog compasses spun without settling on any consistent direction. Dr. Chen's instruments detected environmental changes that suggested the settlement was withdrawing deeper into whatever dimensional space it normally occupied. Temperature drops that violated thermodynamics, atmospheric pressure variations that indicated elevation changes despite no visible alteration in topography, electromagnetic readings that showed energy sources activating throughout the apparently abandoned community. The empty houses began showing signs of occupation that defied direct observation. Smoke appeared at chimneys between one glance and the next. Lights flickered behind windows that remained dark when viewed directly. Sounds of daily life echoed from structures that investigation proved to be completely vacant. But the church bell started tolling again. The bronze notes rolled across the valley with authority that made the remaining team members understand they were no longer welcome in this space. Each chime carried harmonics that resonated in frequency ranges that human hearing shouldn't detect, but that registered in the nervous system as warning signals older than language. Rodriguez made the tactical decision to withdraw before the settlement's defensive measures escalated beyond equipment failure and personnel disappearance. Her team retreated up the mountain trail while documenting effects that suggested reality itself was rejecting their presence. Photographs taken during the withdrawal showed landscape features that shifted between exposures. Audio recordings captured conversation in voices that belonged to none of the team members. But Webb turned back for one final look at the community that had hidden itself for nearly 2 centuries and realized that Harrow's end was no longer concealing itself from government attention. The settlement was preparing for something that required complete isolation from the outside world, even from observers who posed no immediate threat. November 1st was 6 days away. Whatever obligation the covenant demanded of Harrow's end, it couldn't be fulfilled while federal agents monitored from the surrounding ridges. The mountain was preparing to collect what it was owed. The task force established its final monitoring position at Copper Creek, using long-range surveillance equipment that could observe Harrow's end from distances that avoided triggering the settlement's defensive responses. But the data they collected during the days leading up to November 1st revealed a community preparing for events that challenged every assumption about human capability and federal authority. Thermal imaging detected population movements that suggested far more residents than the settlement's apparent capacity could support. People emerged from buildings that investigation had proven to be empty, gathered in numbers that exceeded any reasonable estimate of Harrow's End's population, and participated in activities that extended far into the underground chambers the task force had only begun to explore. The church became the focal point of activity that intensified as October progressed toward its end. Services were conducted according to schedules that bore no relationship to conventional religious calendars, led by figures whose thermal signatures suggested they weren't entirely human. The congregation included individuals whose presence registered on monitoring equipment, despite no visible evidence of their existence. Dr. Chen's atmospheric analysis detected chemical compounds that shouldn't exist in natural concentrations, pheromones that influenced emotional states, airborne substances that altered perception, and molecular structures that resembled neurotransmitters but operated according to principles unknown to medical science. The settlement was preparing its population for experiences that required biochemical modification to survive. Webb understood that the covenant's annual renewal demanded payment in forms that the outside world couldn't comprehend or accept. The abundance that had sustained Harrow's end for nearly 2 centuries came at prices that each generation paid in ways that preserved the community's essential secrets while satisfying obligations to entities that predated human settlement of these mountains. October 31st arrived with weather patterns that violated meteorological predictions. Temperature inversions created microclimates around the settlement that supported plant growth inappropriate for the season or elevation. Atmospheric pressure readings suggested elevation changes that GPS instruments couldn't detect. Cloud formations gathered above the valley in configurations that resembled geometric patterns rather than natural phenomena. The covenant renewal began at sunset with processions that emerged from every building in the settlement. Families carried items that monitoring equipment identified as artifacts, combining organic and technological elements. Tools that channeled energies modern science couldn't measure. Implements that interfaced with biological systems in ways that suggested cybernetic integration, achieved through methods unknown to contemporary engineering. But the true revelation came when the processions converged at the church and continued into chambers that extended deeper into the mountain than any human excavation could have achieved. Ground-penetrating radar tracked the movement of hundreds of people through passages that honeycombed the bedrock in patterns that suggested intelligent design by entities working on geological timescales. The ceremony itself remained beyond the reach of any monitoring technology. Equipment positioned to observe the underground gatherings failed systematically as the night progressed. But acoustic sensors detected sounds that registration described as music, though the frequencies extended far beyond the range of human vocal cords, and the harmonics followed mathematical relationships that human composers had never explored. At midnight, seismic instruments recorded vibrations that suggested massive geological activity, but conventional earthquake detection systems showed no disturbance. Something was moving beneath the mountains that registered as planetary-scale events while producing no surface effects detectable by normal scientific instruments. The silence that followed lasted until dawn on November 1st, when smoke began rising again from chimneys in the settlement that had shown no signs of occupation for over a week. Harrow's End had renewed its covenant for another year. Rodriguez's final report classified the Harrow's End investigation at levels that removed it from standard government databases and restricted access to personnel with clearances Webb didn't possess. The official conclusion stated that the settlement had been abandoned prior to federal contact and posed no ongoing national security concerns. All evidence of technological anomalies, supernatural capabilities, and covenant agreements was filed in repositories that effectively rendered it inaccessible to future researchers. The 3 missing agents were declared victims of a hiking accident that had resulted in their bodies being lost in terrain too dangerous to search comprehensively. Their families received standard death benefits and explanations that discouraged further inquiry. The sophisticated monitoring equipment abandoned in the field was written off as irretrievably damaged by environmental exposure. Webb's surveyor position was terminated through administrative restructuring that eliminated his access to the investigation's classified materials while providing generous severance benefits, contingent on his signing non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties for violation. He understood that his career in government service had ended the moment he discovered a community that federal authority couldn't regulate or contain. Dr. Chen returned to her academic position with research restrictions that prevented her from publishing findings related to her Appalachian fieldwork. Her soil samples were confiscated for additional analysis that would never be completed, and her equipment was upgraded in ways that eliminated its capability to detect the anomalous readings that had first identified Harrow's End's agricultural impossibilities. The antique dealer Harrison Mills received visits from federal agents who expressed interest in purchasing his entire collection of mountain artifacts. The prices offered exceeded market value by margins that made refusal economically impossible, but the transaction included agreements that prevented Mills from discussing the item's origins or capabilities with future collectors or researchers. Dr. Foster's medical records relating to children from Harrow's End disappeared during a computer system upgrade that corrupted files in ways that suggested deliberate data elimination. Her attempts to reconstruct the documentation from memory and backup sources were discouraged through professional pressures that made continuing her rural medical practice dependent on abandoning her research into genetic anomalies among mountain populations. But the government's retreat extended beyond individual careers and evidence suppression. Federal land management policies were modified to create buffer zones around areas where similar settlements might exist, using environmental protection rationales that restricted access while avoiding acknowledgement of the communities those policies were designed to protect. Mapping projects were redirected away from territories that satellite imagery suggested might harbor other hidden populations. Surveillance protocols were established to monitor for signs of additional settlements while maintaining distances that prevented triggering defensive responses. The goal was early detection of communities that might possess capabilities similar to Harrow's End's, allowing for containment strategies that avoided direct confrontation with entities that federal authority couldn't comprehend or control. The United States government had discovered the limits of its jurisdiction within its own territory. Some communities had developed independence that transcended legal or military authority, sustained by agreements with powers that predated any human government and operated according to rules that no human institution could modify or void. Harrow's End remained on no map, acknowledged by no census, regulated by no agency. It continued to exist in spaces between official recognition, thriving through methods that challenged every assumption about human limitations, while honoring obligations that preserved its essential autonomy. The mountain keeps its bargains. Webb returned to private surveying, working for development companies that paid well for expertise in identifying suitable mountain properties while avoiding areas that carried complications beyond normal environmental restrictions. He never discussed his government work, but he developed an instinct for recognizing signs that warned of settlements that existed outside conventional oversight. The indicators were subtle but consistent. Soil compositions that suggested impossible agricultural productivity, topographic anomalies that made GPS instruments unreliable, local folklore that included warnings about areas where travelers should avoid staying overnight. Webb learned to file reports that redirected development pressure away from such territories while maintaining professional credibility through explanations that cited environmental concerns or geological instabilities. His reputation attracted clients seeking properties in remote areas throughout Appalachia, and Webb discovered that Harrow's End represented just one example of communities that had mastered the art of selective invisibility. The mountains harbored dozens of settlements that had negotiated their own forms of independence through methods that kept them beyond the reach of government regulation, corporate development, or academic study. Some maintained their isolation through traditional means: geographic remoteness, economic self-sufficiency, cultural practices that discouraged outside contact. But others, like Harrow's End, had achieved autonomy through agreements that extended beyond normal human capabilities, binding themselves to powers that provided protection and abundance in exchange for obligations that the outside world couldn't comprehend. The hidden communities formed a parallel civilization that had evolved alongside mainstream American society while avoiding detection through methods that ranged from conventional camouflage to phenomena that challenged basic assumptions about reality. They represented alternative paths of human development that had diverged from mainstream culture while maintaining connections to forces that predated European settlement of North America. Webb understood that his discovery of Harrow's End had provided him with glimpses of possibilities that most Americans never suspected existed within their own borders. The United States contained territories that operated according to rules unknown to federal authority, sustained by relationships that transcended legal jurisdiction, and protected by agreements that would endure long after contemporary governments collapsed under the weight of problems they couldn't solve. The mountains remember everything, and some promises bind more than flesh and blood. October fog still rises in those hidden valleys where children grow strong on soil that should be too poor to sustain them, and church bells ring hours that no government clock has ever measured. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.